On the agenda tonight, we're taking our second look at Sweet performing Hellraiser back in 1973. Unfortunately, the video that I did last night has been blocked on copyrights, and that must have happened in the early hours of the morning because a few of you did get to see it. So I'm re-editing and re-uploading. So I'm going to include the link to the performance video from the Sweet playing in 1973 in the description below, and I'll also pin it to the top of the comments. So click on that link, watch the video, and then return here for the analysis, and I'll see you guys in the comment section. And there we have it. The great thing about this performance, it being live but getting such a full sound, because this is something that will fly under the radar, the fact that we've just got guitar, bass, drums, and the lead vocal, where early 70s is when this particular song, Hellraiser, came out. But in the mid-70s, this whole sound mixed with glam as well, really going for it with the image on stage. But there are so many elements in here that they've taken from different genres like pop, for example, and rock, hard rock, and you've got harmonies in there as well, and you've got to be able to do all of the things that these other genres do well, but then just put it into one band, and that's exactly what we get here. Just to explain the intro as well that I gave, because we've got the Sweet as they're known, and also Sweet, they did shorten the band name to just Sweet in the early 70s, but a lot of people listening to this song will make the comparison with Motley Crue and Kickstart My Heart. It's exactly the same riff, and I'm not sure how they got away with doing that, but you can get that going on YouTube if you want to listen to that comparison. Obviously, as soon as we've got this semitone run-up on the guitar with the Motley Crue song, it then does get into a different riff, and it isn't solely centered on this riff that we're hearing. But a really important part of the overall sound that we're getting here is the way that Andy Scott is playing his guitar, and given the fact that we've just got the drums, bass, and guitar setup that I've mentioned, it is so important to fill in as much of that sound as you can with your guitar, and this is exactly what Andy's doing here. Just the riff in general is a chord shape rather than relying on single notes. So it's going to give you a full sound because we're getting more than one note at a time. And this starts on this particular audio that we're listening to is slightly sharp of B. So if you're playing in standard tuning, you can just slide from your B to C and then C sharp, and you have those first three chords of the intro riff that we get. So the way that Andy's playing throughout this whole performance, if he was to add a little bit too much mute to the sound, you'd then be left with dead space, which is the last thing you want with a performance where you've got so few instruments, but also with a composition like this. You want to fill in the sound as much as possible. So we get that throughout the performance in the verses as well, just holding on those chords for as long as possible before moving on. And we've also got this solo section, which shows exactly how Andy is approaching it, because in the solo, and he trades lines between himself and Mick Tucker on drums here. In order to fill out that sound, we've still got chords that we're moving through and a very brief period of a trill in the solo and then back to chords. So it shows how Andy has approached it, because he only goes to that trill momentarily and then gets back to the chord shapes to fill in the sound. I've got to mention as well the overall sound that we get here from a mix perspective, because it has been so well done, and it gives you a great appreciation of the difference between the verse and the chorus in this composition, because when the chorus kicks in and you get those four voices now being strict melodically and harmonizing with each other, it gives such a great contrast to the verse. We've got a super tight rhythm section here as well, and that's Steve Priest on bass, but also let me mention Mick Tucker on drums, because he is doing his fair share of filling in the sound, the way that he's all over that kit and going for it. And there is so much work that Mick gets through and just holds it all together. Obviously he has to be on the same page and really in the pocket with Steve as they are throughout this performance. And when you add into the equation that everyone's playing and singing at the same time here, interestingly, this is something that in the late 60s and very early 70s, the band members only used to sing on the releases and session guys would play in the studio. But at some point, these guys got a little bit frustrated because they wanted to play the instruments themselves and go in a more rocky direction than the songs that were being produced at the time in the studio. So this is a great example of just being let loose to play the music that they wanted to play, but also their ability technically at the instruments and being able to sing. Just to mention Brian Connolly on lead vocal as well, because he had such a unique vocal delivery, and the way that in the verses he doesn't hit any notes, but his vocal is all over the place. It's so interesting because of the change in pitch that we do go through. He is connecting his chest voice with head voice and throwing it all over the place. And when you get something that is the opposite to monotone, which is exactly what we get here, it is always interesting to listen to. He's also throwing the line over to Steve. I think on the original record, it was Brian that did the lead vocal, and then he's effectively talking to himself. But it works really well here live with Steve supplying that other line. It's then having the ability musically to change to the melodic components of the chorus. And this is the thing that anybody can just speak along with a song, maybe not to the level that Brian could, going into his head voice and having all that control and all of that range to make it so interesting to listen to, but then snapping into strict melody and harmonizing with three other people in the band. And this is where it just goes up another level. And some of the range going on there is crazy with those top lines, but also it is so well executed live with this performance, and you have to be a top-level performer, singer, and instrumentalist in order to pull this off when we consider they're playing and singing at the same time. Obviously, with the whole glam movement and the image that went with that, a lot of people might not have given the bands, especially these guys, the amount of credit they deserve from a technical standpoint, because there is so much going on here. There is top-level playing and top-level singing. I think that they were referred to as being bubblegum pop, and having that mixed with hard rock and glam rock, and I think that you could say that there's melodic hard rock in here as well. If you weren't looking at the band, you would certainly lean to that side of things rather than the bubblegum pop side of things, and I think that's a tag that they didn't particularly like, especially when looking at a performance like this, where you can tell that playing their own instruments and the sound that they're going for live here is more of their authentic identity musically. We have such great content in the chorus that is easy to listen to, but also easy to repeat. It has got that hook in there, which is the most important thing when you are writing a song. I always say it's the hardest thing to write good songs, but Sweet had such great songs that were crowd pleasers as well. Everyone could get involved with these choruses. We are going to be getting briefly into the background of the band, but before we do, I just want to say as well that in a setup like this, where you have four vocalists, you cannot have a weakness in any of those voices, because you are only as strong as your weakest singer when you are harmonizing with each other. If one guy is slightly sharp or slightly flat, not on the ball, the whole sound suffers, because that voice will stick out compared to the other three. If the other three guys are nailing it, it doesn't matter, because you've got one guy who's messing up the whole thing. So just quickly, these guys formed around 1962, and it wasn't exactly these guys. There were a lot of personnel changes and chopping and changing, and Ian Gillan was in the band. He went on to then front Deep Purple, but he left in 1965, and very early on, on, 1968, they played at clubs and pubs, and they started to get a bit of a following, and at this time they were known as the Sweet Shop. So due to this success and having a following, they signed with Fontana Records, and they changed their name at this point to The Sweet, because there was already a band called The Sweet Shop. So they recorded and released Slow Motion, and this was in 1968. Unfortunately, that didn't chart, and they got dropped by the record label, even though nowadays, if you can get your hands on Slow Motion, that original release, it does fetch a pretty sum. But at this point, Frank Torpey had been playing guitar for them, but he left after the failure to chart with that particular song. So Mick Stewart joined the band in 1969, and they signed to Parlophone Records. They recorded and released 3 singles, but unfortunately none of those charted, and Mick then left the band, and the rest of the guys had a chance meeting with Phil Wainman, and Phil was the producer on the Slow Motion song that I mentioned earlier. It just so happened that he knew a couple of guys who were writing songs, and this was Nicky Chin and Mike Chapman, who were looking for guys to sing over the top of their demos. Around this time they were auditioning guitarists as well to fill that vacant slot, and this is where Andy Scott came in. He got involved, and they sang on this demo, which was called Funny Funny, and they caught a bit of a break because they managed to perform this on UK TV on a show called Liftoff, and this is in 1970. So they performed this and got a bit of exposure to the point where they signed a management deal, which also included a record deal with RCA Records. With Phil Wainman on production duties, they released Funny Funny in 1971, and that was a huge hit all across Europe. It pretty much got into the top 20 of every chart, and they then released All You'll Ever Get From Me, and this wasn't quite as popular. That song was a re-release from earlier that they tried, and it wasn't popular then either, unfortunately. But they then released, same year, 1971, Coco, which was a huge hit here in the UK. It got to number 2, and they followed that up with Alexander Graham Bell, which got to number 33, so it wasn't quite as popular. An important thing to mention at this point is that the guys weren't playing their instruments at this point. They were literally only supplying the vocals for the songs. The album released that year was called Funny How Sweet Coco Can Be, and that did alright, but it always tended to be the case that sweet albums didn't sell as well as the singles. One of those singles that did really well in 1972 was called Papa Joe, and that got to number 1 in Finland, and it got to number 11 here in the UK. They also followed that up with Little Willie, which reached number 4 here, and also Wig Wham Bam, which was a huge hit here, again number 4 in the charts, but also it was re-released over in the USA in 1973, and that's where it got to number 3 in the charts. An important thing to mention about Wig Wham Bam was that that was the first single where the guys were playing their instruments, and it was a step in that rockier direction with the sound. In 1973 they released Blockbuster, and that was a huge number 1 here in the UK, and it stayed there for 5 consecutive weeks. Then Hellraiser got to number 2 in the UK, so right up to date with this video. And in 1973 is when they released their first album in the USA. So at this time they were appearing on TV, getting a lot of exposure. Also, they had this image that was really pushing the boundaries at that time. Like a lot of glam bands, they were maybe in competition with each other, seeing who could push the boundaries the furthest. But this was around the time as well that they wanted less bubblegum pop sound and more rock, because now they're playing their own instruments. So they changed their name to Sweet and got rid of the. And in Scotland, this is where they were playing a gig, and they got bottled off the stage, had loads of stuff thrown at them, but that was the show that then inspired them to write the song Ballroom Blitz, which they released in 1973, and that was a huge hit. Just to mention that Ballroom Blitz was a Nicky Chin and Mike Chapman track. They were still involved with the band from the songwriting perspective at that time. Unfortunately, in 1974, Brian Connolly damaged his throat during a fight, And this was also when they're recording the album Sweet Fanny Adams, which when released got into the top 40 in the UK, but it wasn't a massive hit. And some of the shows were cancelled as well, citing a throat infection that Brian had, whereas it was the injury that was really causing him some trouble. In that same year, they released Desolation Boulevard, another album, and in 1975, Fox on the Run, one of the singles, that was the first that was self-written and produced by the band, and it was a huge hit. It got to number 2 here in the UK, and it also got to number 5 in the USA and turned into their biggest selling single. In 1976, they released Give Us a Wink, and they toured the USA playing tracks from Desolation Boulevard, but unfortunately the tour didn't sell really well. It wasn't financially successful, to the point where they did have to cancel a few of those dates. But in 1977 they released Off the Record, and they had to cancel their upcoming tour with an up-and-coming band called Aerosmith, because Brian's voice was obviously more hoarse than it was before, the throat problem that he had, and in fact they didn't tour at all in 1977. In 1978 they released Level Headed, and also the single Love Is Like Oxygen, and this was their last top 10 hit in the UK and also in the USA. In 1978 they were supporting Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band. You can find Bob and the guys here on the channel somewhere if you want to check them out independently. But unfortunately, Brian collapsed on stage through drunkenness at one of those gigs, and the band had to continue on without him, which obviously gave rise to tensions in the band. And it so happened that in 1979 Brian Connolly left the band. They continued as a three-piece and started working on Water's Edge, the album that was to be released in 1980, and tragically Mick Tucker's wife drowned in the bath at home, and that was right at the end of 1979. So during 1980 they just focused on the album and didn't do any live work, and in 1981 is when they recorded Identity Crisis, and this wasn't released until 1982, and it was released only in West Germany and also Mexico. The thing is, when it was released, the band had gone their separate ways, so they'd been disbanded for about a year at that point. As time progressed, the guys had their own versions of the band, just having their name in front of the band name, and it was agreed between all of them that they could do that. Unfortunately, in 1997, Brian Connolly passed away, and Mick Tucker also passed away in 2002. But it's great to have a look at these guys back in the mid-70s in full flow, but also with the technical ability, not only at their instruments, but vocally, in order to nail these 4-part harmonies. Thank you guys so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!